welcome to the webinar today. I'm Sealey from Global Net 21, and with Nerina Finetto, who you will see in a minute, we are doing a series of webinars called Conversations Across Borders, where we look at issues and problems that confront us all globally. And today we're doing a rather special webinar where we're going to look at the work of one particular man, Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the second Secretary General of the United Nations and one of the two Secretary Generals that we all tend to remember. I certainly do at my age anyhow. Now, he has left a legacy because he's a man who's done a lot of work in his time, but also a lot of work outside of his job that sort of shaped his vision. And we've got his grandniece with us today, Caroline Hammarskjöld, and she's going to talk about not only the legacy of her great uncle, but also about the work she's done to follow on his vision. So, thank you, Caroline, for joining us today. And maybe I could start by asking you a little bit about yourself. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and your background and what's led you to what you're doing now?
I see. Yes, thank you for having me. I'm very thrilled to be able to be part of this webinar. I am the great niece of Dag Hammarskjöld, and my mother was his goddaughter. She had a very tight relationship with Dag as her uncle, and I have been brought up learning about him as a relative, but it wasn't until I grew older and had some life experience that I started becoming more and more interested in his legacy. It was basically when I came in contact with people who are so interested in his legacy and follow in his footsteps that I realized what an impact he still has in today's society. And that is the reason I started doing further research and started getting into the involvement with different groups and organizations, trying to make available his legacy and whatever he stood for. Because I believe that today's generation, the future generation, can learn a lot from him.
Okay, well, as I said, we have Nerina with us as well today, who does these interviews with me. So over to you, Nerina.
Thank you, Francis, and really happy to have you with us, Caroline, today.
Thank you.
And Dag Hammarskjöld was the second Secretary General of the UN. He worked a lot also here in Sweden, and he received a posthum Nobel Prize.
That's right.
Can you tell us shortly who was Dag Hammarskjöld?
Yes, he grew up in a family with three brothers. His father was the Prime Minister of Sweden during World War I, and all the brothers ended up doing a lot of civil servant jobs, and he was brought up in an environment with a father that was very disciplinary, and a mother that was very warm and loving. So there were two types of personalities that shaped Dag and his brothers, and I believe that that's what's ultimately created his personality, where he had the capability of being very strong and go with his convictions and his beliefs and follow through with it, at the same time keeping the humanity, see every single human being and for their worth. And the combo of that makes a great leader, I think.
Well, he was a diplomat for sure, but he was more than that, wasn't he? He did lots of things. He wrote books, he was a photographer. How do you think this sort of broad hinterland affected him and shaped his vision?
Incredibly much, I have to say, specifically arts. He was a man of culture. He read tremendously. He knew 4 languages, and he translated a lot of books in those 4 languages. He loved art, he loved photography, and this is something that we later discovered when we went through the family albums. We discovered that what a talent he was as a photographer. So last year I had an exhibition in Sweden where we showed his photographs to the public for the very first time. But I do believe that he very much believed in the word, respect for the word, to care for the word, and how you express yourself is essential to communicating, to understanding, and to be a good leader also. So I think hiking in the mountains, he was a mountaineer, the photography, the art, the music, and all that was sort of his outlet, so he could focus on the difficult tasks that he was presented in the UN primarily.
Nerina?
In the book Markings, you can read, I ask for the unreasonable, that life should have a meaning. Where did he find meaning? Where did he get inspirations, in your opinion?
In all those different interests. I think that building up to that point where he wrote 1952, that was the year prior to becoming the Secretary General of the United Nations, he had a lot of self-doubt. This particular book, Markings, which is still sold all over the world today, it's a collection of poems that he wrote during his lifetime that was not really something people were aware of during his lifetime, but it became a different side where he basically had a conversation with himself and God, and he had a lot of self-doubt and what was his mission here in life, even though he was a very accomplished man. I mean, he worked for the Ministry of Finance in Sweden. He was the chairman of the board of the Bank of Sweden, etc. He was very well accomplished, but he found strength in his interest and the constant search for meaningfulness. You know, to act as a civil servant was super important to him. He didn't want to be connected to any particular political party. He wanted to be able to serve man and carry the world and solve problems. And he was presented this possibility, 1953, the year after he wrote, I ask for the impossible, that life should have a meaning. 1953, life had a meaning for Dag, because now he was able to not be politically attached, but to be able to serve man in a much greater context in the world. So that was sort of his breakthrough.
Okay, well, let's look at his sort of role in the United Nations. He was the second Secretary General. And in a way, just after the war, people might have thought, well, he was going to be a technocrat, he was going to be a diplomat. But he was more than a civil servant, wasn't he? He brought leadership to the UN. Do you want to tell us about that?
Absolutely. Since he was the second Secretary General, UN was still in the beginning stages where it wasn't completely organized yet. So he stepped in, and they thought he was a civil servant that was very modest man that didn't have the caliber that he eventually presented. He was actually able to organize the United Nations and shape it to something that was more of an efficient organization. One of the first things that he started doing was that he collected all the staff from I don't know how many hundreds of countries and thousands of staff that he wanted to meet personally, and he wanted to gather them to create this team spirit, that they were all in the same boat, so to say, and with the same vision. And to him, the UN Charter was something he carried with him all the time, and he was reading it thoroughly and really was loyal to the UN Charter. And a couple of things that he came up with that are still very, very big today in the way that United Nations works and diplomats work is the silent diplomacy, that he came up with this concept of how important it is to leave yourself for a moment and step into someone else's vision and look through their eyes and try to figure out, you know, where are they coming from, like what are their values and how can I reach this human being and have conversation and how can we resolve the conflict. So silent diplomacy is something that's practiced today very widely in the world, and he also started the whole process of the Basque Bleu, the peacekeeping forces with the United Nations, the way it looks today. So those were a couple of things that he implemented in the UN organization.
Okay. And Caroline, and he planned and supervised every detail in the creation of the meditation room at the UN headquarters. And this project tells a lot about him, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a very good point, actually, because he brought the humanity into this building, a building where the staff was struggling to resolve conflicts on a daily basis. He strongly believed that the only way you can sustain and work sustainably is if you can get away from all the noise and come to a space like the meditation room where you can sit in silence and introspectively like try to search for answers or maybe just find silence, because he believed that if you couldn't fill yourself with energy and put a perspective on things and fuel your soul, then you could not move forward with the projects that were so challenging. I think this goes for all human beings. We all need to step back sometimes and just be in silence and tune inward. And he actually wrote in his poetry book, Markings, that the longest journey is the journey inward. And it makes a lot of sense. So this beautiful room, there's a mural on the wall that was created by a Swedish famous abstract painter. His name was Bo Beskov, and they were very close friends. And he created this masterpiece that's not connected to a specific religion. It's for all religions, but it's just like an abstract art piece that sort of gives you a balance when you look at it, when you sit in this beautiful room.
Okay, Nerina?
Yes, and he was the second Secretary General, and of course it was the beginning of the UN, and of course the Second World War had a great influence probably on his thinking and on a lot of people at that time that really tried to make everything in order not to have to experience war again. What do you think about this?
You mean as far as like creating world peace in the midst of the Cold War?
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was in the middle of the decolonization period, and that ultimately led to his death in Congo, where he died tragically in an airplane crash. And there's still a mystery surrounding his death, and we don't know yet if it was planned assassination or if it was an accident, but there are many ideas surrounding that. But at all costs, he wanted to really, because he was so focused on humanity and self-worth and all that all human beings like are equals. He definitely believed that independence for the colonies specifically, and he really worked hard. There's a very famous speech actually in the UN that took place that some people may have heard of already. It was the Soviet Union President Khrushchev that held a speech and demanded Dag Hammarskjöld's exit from the United Nations, because the big countries like Soviet Union and England and USA, they were controlling a lot of what's happening when it came to the conflict resolutions in the smaller countries. But Dag decided to step away for 45 minutes, and he wrote this really incredible speech where he basically stated that I'm here for the small nations, and I will stay at my post as long as they want me to. And it's a very powerful speech that I believe is out there in the internet that you can look up if you want. And he got standing ovations for about 15 minutes after the speech. And that was sort of a critical moment in his career also, where people listened to him for real. And the big countries had to like step down a little bit and respect the order.
You were saying, of course, he did this just after the war, when colonization was ending, when people were trying to build a new world order of global governance, when the world was coming together. But now we're seeing the world falling apart. We're seeing more chaos. How do you think he would have reacted to the world today?
I do believe that he would have referred again to the UN Charter. I think that over the years now, since his passing, United Nations has also developed into a much larger organization. It's both good and at times, you know, it becomes chaotic, and the leadership there is lacking a little bit, has been, and it's I do strongly believe that he would look back at the UN Charter, and he would also state that like one of his poems when he writes never look down to test the ground before taking your next step. Only he who keeps his eye fixed on the far horizon will find his right road. So everybody should carry that within themselves, and you should look inward to find answers, and you need to collectively work together. You need to make the steps up that mountain. He wrote another poem that says, let's see, don't measure the mountain before you reach the top, then you shall see how low it was. So it takes time, it takes work, it takes a collective mindset, and we need to do this together. It's not easy, but I think he would try to bring order and focus into the organization again. And that's one of the main reasons I'm working with this, to sort of like revive him and his beliefs, so that United Nations and the world leaders will actually be able to take this in and see like how can we do this together. It's very, very important.
I mean, you were saying you're trying to take on his work. In what way are you trying to do that? What are you doing?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm trying to take on his work, because I'm not the Secretary General of the United Nations. What I'm trying to do is make available his legacy in many ways. And I believe for myself that I would like to do it in a similar way, the way Dag did it a lot of times. He connected art and culture with a message. And now previously last year, I had that big art exhibition where I presented Dag Hammarskjöld's photographs for the first time. And then along with that, we created a short film also communicating the message, his own message. It was actually a speech that he held at the United Nations in 1960. And then that was 15 years into the United Nations existence. And he's comparing the United Nations Charter and the purpose of the United Nations to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And he does this in a very poetic, beautiful way, showing how we have too much in common, too much at risk. We can't lose our common denominators just like and allow this chaos to go on. We need to like collectively gather ourselves and realize what we have in common, and then move forward and make the steps. The interesting thing is this particular speech is very relevant today. And this year, 2020, it's 75 years since Dag Hammarskjöld, well, I'm sorry, it's 75 years of the United Nations existence. So we are still at the same spot where he had that speech in 1960, it feels like.
Okay, Nerina?
Yes. Yes, you just mentioned this, but how important do you think that was and is a vision of conflict resolution in today's world? Also his approach to...
His approach to conflict resolution is essential. I think that if you really learn about the silent diplomacy, and not just at the surface and make your own interpretation of it, if you read about it and learn about it, I do believe that all of us can use it. I mean, we can use it in our daily lives, like conflict resolution in your home, with your family, with your kids, with your husband, wife, you know, on so many levels you can learn these tools that he applied. So it's very relevant today.
Yes, and
you
mentioned that in 1961 he was on a peacekeeping mission to Congo, and shortly after midnight the airplane crashed, and all 16 people on board died there. And we do not know what really happened, but in a recent documentary, somebody said Africa would have been a completely different continent today if Dag Hammarskjöld was allowed to live. And what do you think about this?
I do believe that he was so true to his own beliefs that he would have pursued. For him, it was important to meet with these leaders in these countries and to have the one-on-one meeting. You know, it's face-to-face is very important. I think that he would have been true to his beliefs and his convictions, and he would have pursued this anyway in a friendly manner, obviously. I think that he would have reached further, yes, absolutely.
And what made him such a great peace seeker or peacekeeper and leader in the end?
I think that he believed in man. He believed in the spirit of man, and that all people are good. And sometimes people don't behave well. But deep down, he believed that everybody is good, and he would have stood up for his convictions about that, and he still had that belief to the very bitter end. I want to mention a quote that his mother wrote to him in the Bible that he received when he was christened. Is that what you call it? Christening. And she wrote in it, you must be truthful until death, then I shall give you the crown of life. So he carried that with him all his life, and that is why I believe he would have still continued the same manner, to believe in the good, believe in the man. He had values very, very deep inside of him.
I mean, we were talking about yesterday and today, and one of the big problems, in fact, probably the biggest problem we face today is climate change.
Yes.
And how do you think your great-grandfather, your great-uncle, I'm making him your grandfather now, your great-uncle, would have approached climate change when the world is divided, when some people don't believe it? What about his legacy is important that you could take forward in dealing with the new situation we're in?
That is the million-dollar question. But if you're asking me personally, I do believe that he would have been proud of the United Nations for putting forth the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17, and he would have made sure that that was rolling out properly. He would have listened to the young generation. Now we have Greta Thunberg, who's famous, who's running the revolution of young people trying to save the planet, and he was very much for nature and preservation. So he would have given her a lot of mandate to move forward, and he would have ensured that working on local levels and global level at the same time when it comes to these different sustainable goals is essential. I think that he would have believed that that was a good way to move forward, but it has to move faster.
So if he were to rewrite his famous speech that you mentioned, where he says, I'm here for the small nations, the time of climate change, he would have rewritten it and said, I'm here for the future generations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That he would have said.
Okay, Nerina?
Yes, this is, you already mentioned how he inspired your work, and this is, I think that indeed also the young generation are at the core of what you would like to do. Could you tell us more about what are the main messages and the main works that you would like to do?
The main message I would say is listen to each other, tune inward, and be open-minded. Accept other views and visions and behaviors or whatever. He would have been he would have wanted the young to connect with the older generation as well, and to just collectively just be open-minded and move forward. And I think that working with your intuition is also something that is important, because that's what guided him in his life. To look inward is super important, because otherwise you don't really know where your values are to begin with. So you can only start by changing yourself. So that is also an approach I think that he would have suggested.
You mentioned that you had a photo installation here last year, and you want to discover also this part of Dag, because he was a leader who really appreciated humanities. And as I understand, it is something that you would like to more.
Okay, I understand. Yes, my vision is to make available his legacies through his own art and through his own poetry, his own words. And I do that through publications, I do that through exhibitions, I do that through lectures, many different ways. My goal is also to start some sort of foundation where we can work and have workshops, and also invite companies to share and find tools in his legacy that they can apply to their businesses. I think it's like throwing a rock in the water, then you get a bunch of rings and it spreads. So my vision is basically to collect people and communicate a message through his forms of art. It's his words, not my words, but I'm just like the link to the future, I guess. And I feel like it's essential, because every single time I meet someone and mention his name, whether they know about him or they don't, once they learn more about him, they're absolutely fascinated and they want to learn more. A great way to learn about the inside of Dag Hammarskjöld is to read this book, Markings. In Swedish, it's called Vägmärken. And I think every single human being can relate to those poems.
Okay. Caroline, sorry, do you have a favorite quote that you would like to share with us?
I do, actually, because a lot of times, and I'm thinking especially about the young generation now, I think that the young generation is doubtful for the future. They feel like nature is getting worse. They may not have a planet in the near future, or you know, you go through hard things in life. But even Dag, who appeared to be a leader and so strong, and he had no doubts or whatever, he had a lot of doubts. And therefore, I'd like to read a poem that he wrote the last month before he died. He was obviously under a lot of pressure, which we all can be under pressure in many different ways. It doesn't have to be to the level of the Secretary General, but you know, in our own lives, in our own spheres, we can have conflicts or divorces, and you know, experiencing death in the family and things like that. And we need to be reminded about something, which I will read here, and hopefully you get the point. He wrote this July 6, 1961, so just a few months prior to his death. Tired and lonely, so tired the heart aches. Meltwater trickles down the rocks. The fingers are numb, the knees tremble. It is now that you must not give in. On the path of the others are resting places, places in the sun where they can meet. But this is your path, and it is now that you must not fail. Weep if you can, weep, but do not complain. The way chose you, and you must be thankful.
Okay, that's fantastic, and I think, you know, that's a nice quote that I think we could put up self-contained on its own and get people to realize that in the problems we have today, that is as relevant as ever. Anyhow, just very last question: if people want to find out about the work you do, or they want to make contact with you in any way, how do they go about it?
They can go in on my website. And it's www.hammarskjöld with skjold.org. That's where they can find me. Okay,
well that's good, and we'll obviously disseminate that as well, so people know where to find you. Anyhow, we've sort of come to the end now of a really good half hour, and I think it's been fascinating to talk about your great uncle in the way that you have, to learn more about him and to learn about his legacy, which has so much relevance today. So thank you for doing it. And
well, thank you very much, and I hope more people are inspired by these words and start to learn more about him and what he actually did, and hopefully they can apply some of this in their own lives, and it'll be like rings on water, you know, it'll spread. The message will spread naturally.
Yeah, well, let's hope those ripples do spread. So thank you, and thank you, Nerina, for doing this with me as always. And you know, it's been a really great, informative, and insightful interview. So we'll end this webinar now.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thank you so much, Francis and Nerina. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.